Welcome to From the Front Line with Ed Kelly.
Welcome to From the Front Line, where we discuss both global health and biopharma topics. I'm your host, Paul Rutter. Today, we're excited to have Mark Kamau with us. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Mark Kamau. I live in Nairobi, here in Kenya, in East Africa, and I am a human-centered designer. And in my profession, I actually help design products for Africa and emerging markets by making sure that we engage people within their contexts so that the products serve their needs.
Thank you for joining us, Mark. Maybe let's start at the beginning. How did you get into design?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting. It's an interesting question and story because I actually wanted to play for Manchester United. So when I was growing up, I actually wanted to be a soccer player, and so I'd get out of school, go to the practice field, and I actually got pretty good at playing soccer and or football, and I got actually to the under-21 national team. And so I was the captain and goalkeeper for the under-21 national team. We did the trials, but then the problem was, unfortunately, here there's a problem with corruption. So whenever we would get, money that's supposed to be paid to the players, we weren't getting the money. And so it wasn't a sustainable way for me to continue to support myself and my family. And so then I was actually at my wit's end. And then there's this group of ladies who came from the Netherlands to the community where I lived because I grew up in Islam. And they said, they've been seeing a lot of stories about young people and the conditions of people in the slums, but they are told by Western journalists. So they came with these 6 old Macs, Mac computers, and they said, we'd like to teach a bunch of you how to use computers so that we can hear the stories of people from the slums. From the source. And so the idea back then was to actually make a blog, and then the stories of people from the slums would be told by people who live in the slums. And so they taught us how to make websites and build a blog. Back then you didn't have the systems that allow you to actually just plug and play a blog. You had to code one from scratch. And then I found out that I was good with computers. And so then, that led me into a journey into this new career. And then I landed in Europe. And then I was working in Berlin. And then I was seeing this process we're using to actually really contextualize spaces and design for people. And at some point, we were designing this shop for Hugo Boss. And it basically was this experience where Hugo Boss is supposed to feel the same in Milan, in Berlin, in London. Whenever you walk into Hugo Boss, you should feel like you're in a Hugo Boss space. And so that's how I was introduced into human-centered design. But then I'm looking at this and I'm like, back home, people are struggling with real problems. And here I am designing for luxury, and it just didn't sit right with me, and actually we have this phrase where we say you're scratching at fleas, and back home they're lion-sized problems. And so that's actually how I got into human-centered design. And I was looking back at home, and there's this hub, it's called the iHub, where young people from different walks of life were working with technology to try and solve problems for the communities they came in: agriculture, health, you name it. But then they were making products that were not resonating with the users they targeted. And I was like, maybe I could play a part. And so I contacted the founder, Eric Hassman. We actually met in a conference where I was speaking in Amsterdam, and we talked about it. And I went back, and through his help, I set up the first open human-centered design lab in Africa. I didn't have any template. There was no example. Anyway, long story short, I started helping all these startups, 200 strong, contextualize their creative innovations. They were technically brilliant, but then they weren't resonating with users. So it became that bridge. The lab became that bridge between users and this technology. And after that, then, kept growing and training more people, consulting, and basically growing the practice here in the continent.
That is a fantastic story, Mark, from participant through to leading human-centered design. Maybe let's get very practical. Human-centered design has become such a buzzword. But in practical terms, what does it mean to you? How do you go about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you're right. For me, human-centered design really means centering people who are most proximate to the challenge you're trying to solve, and making sure that they are at the center of the process, and they are not just ticking a box, but you genuinely are engaging them all across the process. And I think that I could give you a quick example. While I was at the UX lab at the iHub, a company that was formed by Eric Hassman, Brick, was making it was actually making these small routers. And the aim of the router was to make sure that there was consistent internet connectivity in spaces where there was challenges with electricity and challenges with connectivity. And that's a situation you find, especially back then, you'd find consistently in Africa, where you're in the middle of a call like this or in the middle of work, and then the power goes. So your laptop is on, but you have no internet. So they were trying to make up a backup for the internet. And basically, the backup for the internet meant you had this small device which had a battery, and you could put a SIM card in, and then you could carry it around, and it would form basically your mobile internet connectivity portal. But anyway, they said this is rugged internet for Africa. And we were like, okay, but have you tested this with users? And so we embarked on this journey from Nairobi to Johannesburg. And this is the kind of human-centered design practice I really like, where you genuinely go into communities. So we went into 13 countries, driving into villages, camping and staying with the communities. For example, living and camping in a school, and we see how kids come in, interact with teachers, and then we have the device, and then we are testing the utility of what we're proposing as a solution with them. And then immediately we started seeing that this doesn't work. When we would go to a community hospital, they'd be like, yeah, but I haven't got a mobile phone. So how am I going to connect to your device? And by the way, the biggest issue we have is storing our user data and making sure it's encrypted and secure. Like, how can I access patient records without having to go through a manual process? That would be more useful to me than the internet. And so we started seeing, and the same thing we see in schools, where we're like, okay, but we could actually store already prepared books into a device without having to go online. So we started seeing use cases that we couldn't imagine from a lab in Nairobi when we went into the communities. And that resulted in us stopping from making a router. We now made a microserver. And what this new device, the SuperBrick, would do is it had 5 terabytes of space, encryption, and computing power, as well as the internet. The second thing we saw was that, hey, we don't have consistent power. How are we going to charge this thing? So now we made it possible to charge it with solar. The other use case we saw is that one device per person is too expensive. How can we make one that can be shared by a community to save costs? And number 3, can it actually be mounted outside so that it broadcasts over a larger area? And all these scenarios we designed for. And so the SuperBrick now could be installed outside, have over 50 concurrent users, and it also could do a lot more that accommodated the context and the use cases we saw on the ground. And this is an example of basically taking an idea or a product and being genuine about seeing how it's used in context and being willing to change so that you accommodate users. And for me, that's true human-centered design.
That's great. Okay, so overall, how did that process change the product from its initial vision?
Yes, that's a good question. So the initial vision was to actually make a router which allowed people to go online. But then when we went to the field and did all these studies and tests with communities and people who were going to use it, we realized we needed a microserver. And the difference between a router and a microserver is that a router simply allows for connectivity from one device to another. A microserver allows you to actually store content and have some computing power. So if you imagine in a school context, you can store locally. For example, in a 5 terabyte drive, you can store thousands of books and thousands of videos. And even when there is no connectivity, people are still able to access the content. And this is really important in Africa because you have challenges with connectivity and challenges with power. The other thing is we also it also allows for hospitals, for example, local clinics, to store and access patient data at a local level. And the other thing we added onto it is to add a battery so that even when there's no power, you still have the ability to use the microserver. So all these are features that we added and changed from the vision to actually accommodate the real context on the ground.
That's great. And all of that through this huge road trip through 13 countries from Nairobi to Johannesburg. That's an incredible story. Going one level deeper into when you're engaging with the individuals and the groups to get this data, what are you doing methodologically to make sure that you're hearing people in the most productive, authentic way?
That's a good question. I think that one of the things that I've realized over the years is that context matters. So, for example, the feedback we were getting from people when we had a lab, basically had a two-way mirror, like the FBI, where we would have people come in and give us feedback. So removing people from their context and bringing them to a foreign context gives you totally different feedback than actually you removing yourself from the office and going to the context where people are, where they're comfortable. So one of the things that is important is to make sure that you actually go to where the people you're designing with are, because that allows you, number one, that it allows them to speak from what you call their home turf, where they're comfortable and they're able to give you open feedback. Number two, it is important to actually use different methods. For example, sometimes people do focus groups, and then there's a person who has more confidence and is able to speak out. And then sometimes they take up all the space and they speak, and everybody else kind of follow their lead. But then ensuring that even the person who's the most quiet, you observe and you actually make sure you give space to people who are sometimes even more quiet, and then go with them to the side where they actually can freely express their opinion in a safe environment. That's also important. And I think that at the end of the day, you also need to observe, because sometimes people tell you things that they want you to hear because they think that that's what you're after. But then how do you ask open-ended questions that allow for open-ended answers? And probably the most important tool is to seek stories. So, for example, when somebody tells me something, I say, when was the last time that happened to you? And then they say, oh, there was a day I was going to the market. And then it actually turns into this real life story. And in there are so many insights. So seeking stories and experiences rather than just asking questions in an interview format allows for you to genuinely and authentically connect with people through stories and not questions. I could give you an example of what goes wrong when you don't do human-centered design properly.
Perfect.
So what I mean by designing for people in their context and understanding their context, I could give you an example. For example, I lived in Arusha, working with a community there. And one time there was this lady who came from the Netherlands to see the country because of the safari and the animals and wildlife. And while the lady landed there, she came from the Netherlands with a gentleman, and they came to see a Maasai community. And these women had prepared very elaborately to welcome her. And so they had all this colorful jewelry, and they welcomed her with dance, and they gave her the little food that they had. So she was touched by their generosity. And she's like, these people have so little, yet they're so generous towards me. And she's basically a reclusive millionaire back in the Netherlands. And so she asked this gentleman, a Dutch gentleman who had brought her to this community, what can I do for them? Because he lived in Tanzania for a bit. And so he said, oh, I know what you're going to do for them. They have cattle. And their cattle produce milk. So we're going to make them a cheese factory. And so in the middle of nowhere, you can imagine in the middle of nowhere in Africa, in Tanzania, they went and brought this gigantic milk processing equipment to make stainless steel shining. It's like almost an alien object landing in the middle of nowhere. And basically, they put these two huge cheese making equipment into the community, and they needed 20,000 liters to turn one on. And they had to power it with diesel because there was no electricity, and basically extremely inefficient. But anyway, he said to people, now bring the milk. Guess how many liters they got? They need 20,000 to start one of the two machines, and he could only find 20 liters. Why? Because Maasai people are pastoralists. When they were there, it was green and they were all in one place. But when they had finished preparing these machines, all the communities had scattered to go find pasture, and there was no cattle anymore. And so not understanding the context of this community meant that they spent a lot of money in a wasteful way. And now, to save face, this gentleman had actually to buy 500 cattle and zero graze them, now finding feed and trying to actually make this work. But if you look at this, it isn't what the community needed. It's what he thought, because he controlled the pass and the access to this lady. It's what he thought was necessary. And that is the antithesis of human-centered design.
That's an amazing example, so well-intentioned, but essentially did more harm than good. I mean, that's that in some ways that people might hear that and think, well, that's an extreme example, but do you think that that is the tip of the iceberg and that this kind of thing is happening all the time? Do you think that things have changed over time and that these kind of projects are becoming more human-centered as you look back over your career to date?
Yes, I think that if you look at the numbers, the amount of aid that actually has flown into Africa is in the millions, into the millions, possibly billions of dollars, and the effect that has had has been less than satisfactory. And I actually think that part of the problem is that the solutions that are deployed have not been as human-centered in the past, and had human-centered design been involved in the deployment of this aid and these solutions, we would have better results. But I actually, on the brighter side, I actually think that more and more people are recognizing that the need for human-centered design. So in my career, I actually have seen more and more use of human-centered design as a practice in the deployment of solutions by engaging people within communities to make sure that solutions that are deployed involve them. And so I think we have a brighter future because more people are involved in human-centered design in the deployment of solutions in Africa.
That's great. If I could just ask you one more question, looking to the future, I guess, if you think about, 5-10 years time, how do you think things will be? What do you think is the future for human-centered design?
That's a really interesting and challenging question. The future for human-centered design. I actually think that in an ideal world, I would like for human-centered design to be a requirement for every project or every solution that's deployed in Africa. In my view, that should be the future, where if there is no human-centered design component, that it is a deal breaker. And I think that in my view, in the future, that should happen. Even governments today, like our government now, requires by law public participation. It's not practiced in the right way, but already you're seeing policy that's moving towards this direction. And I think the corporate world should also embrace this, where no project is done without adequate engagement of communities that the project is meant to impact.
That is great. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Mark. It's fascinating to talk to you. Charlotte, anything else we should ask Mark?
I was just wondering, so what do you do when you don't manage to get that kind of community engagement and when people don't want to give feedback or don't want to take part?
Actually, here's the most interesting thing. The most reluctant people to get involved give the best feedback. And again, since I've done this for a while, I have tons of examples. It's just that we don't have the time for it. But how much time do we have?
You go, don't worry. We have time.
I give you one quick example. So we went to this community. So Stanford University came and hired me. And they wanted to understand why there are these quack doctors. So in slums, you have these people who treat people, but they're not qualified doctors. And so it's like the hypothesis we had is that these people are actually taking advantage of poor people who cannot afford to go to a real hospital. And so you can imagine a quack doctor doesn't want to talk to you because they're not licensed. They're afraid that they're going to go to jail. And they feel like, they're self-aware of what they're doing. But anyway, so it's one of the ways to actually engage people is to make sure you engage a local person who actually knows this. Like Zero in Kuala, we have a local connect. We call basically a local fixer. His name is Zero, and he basically allows us to go into spaces as strangers would be allowed. So one of the tactics is actually to work with somebody who's trusted in the community to connect to these people. And this doctor finally, after I think 1 hour, 45 minutes of negotiations, allowed us to speak with him. And guess what? It was the most fascinating interview because he says, hey, I work as a cleaner in one of our major hospitals. And at night, the main doctor is a drunk. So he started leaving me different tasks as he goes drinking. And he says, so when this patient wakes up, who's pregnant, it was basically in a maternity ward, make sure that you give her this quantity of that, and make sure. So basically, slowly, he started learning practically how to take care of patients because the doctor was basically absconding his duties to go get drunk. And the cleaner was actually taking over his shift and he was instructing him what to do. And when he would go back to Mathare, there would be these pregnant women who were in distress, and the nearest hospital is 45 minutes away walking in the middle of the night. And he's like, okay, let me try to help. And then he would deliver babies, and then he wouldn't charge them. So basically, he was being a good Samaritan. And his reputation in the community was stellar because people were like, were it not for him, I don't know what would have happened to my baby or the pregnant mom. And he would actually offer care. So he actually had the right intention and the right motivation. He just didn't have the right qualifications. So we went there thinking that this gentleman takes advantage of people, yet he actually is helping people. So our hypothesis was completely turned on its head. And the question we asked is, how might we empower him to have the right skills so he can actually help people safely? And we ended up actually thinking of how to take him to school because he had the intention to help people. But then in the beginning, we didn't think he wouldn't want to talk to us, but the result ended completely differently. So in fact, I'm more excited when people don't want to talk to me because I feel like I know that's where the juiciest insights come from.
Thank you very much, Mark. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks to Mark Kamau for joining us. For more information about human-centered design and Mark's work, visit design.africa or mark.africa. We hope this discussion was beneficial to you. To learn more about From the Front Lines, visit apiject.com.
As always, thanks for listening to From the Front Line with Ed Kelly. From the Front Line is produced by Kate Scott with lead writer Charlotte Mackay.
The views, thoughts and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views, thoughts and opinions of the host, sponsor, speaker's employer or any other organisation or individual mentioned.